All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty complex and potentially impactful. I mean, we're talking about President Trump's executive order to shrink 7 federal agencies.
Yeah, it's a big one. And, on the surface, it might seem like just another bureaucratic reshuffling, kind of boring stuff.
Right, exactly. But this goes way deeper. It has the potential to reshape America's voice on the world stage and even impact how you get your news.
Absolutely. And that's why we're here to break it down, to look beyond the headlines and really understand what this order means for America and the world.
So let's start with a quick overview. What exactly does this order do, and what kind of sources are we looking at here?
Well, the order itself targets 7 federal agencies, but the one that's really raising eyebrows is the U.S. Agency for Global Media, or USAGM for short.
USAGM. Okay, so for our listeners who might not be familiar with that one.
Right. So USAGM oversees some of America's most well-known international broadcasting networks, like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
Ah, okay, yeah. I've definitely heard of Voice of America. I mean, those are the folks broadcasting American-backed news and information to millions of people around the world, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And often in places where a free press is, well, not so free.
Right. So we're talking about places where getting accurate information can be really difficult, where people rely on these outlets to counter propaganda and get a different perspective.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And that's what makes this executive order so significant. It's
Yeah.
throwing a wrench into a system that's been in place for decades, a system that's been crucial in promoting American values and countering disinformation.
Yeah, I was actually doing a little reading on USAGM's history, and it's pretty fascinating. These organizations have been around since the Cold War, countering Soviet propaganda.
That's right. They were on the front lines of the information war back then.
Yeah.
And now they're facing a whole new set of challenges in the digital age with modern information warfare tactics.
So it's like history repeating itself, but with a 21st century twist.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so important. We need to understand not just what this order does, but what it means in the context of this evolving information landscape.
Okay, so we've got the what. Now let's get into the why. What are the motivations behind this move to shrink USAGM?
Well, on the surface, the administration is saying it's all about efficiency, cutting budgets, reducing federal influence, the usual stuff.
Right, the classic smaller government argument.
Exactly. But beneath that, there are at least 4 potential motives at play that we need to unpack.
Okay, hit me with.
So first up, you've got the classic smaller government argument, streamlining bureaucracy, cutting waste, all that good stuff.
Something President Trump has championed throughout his tenure, for sure.
Right, and this executive order could be seen as an extension of that philosophy, reducing the size and scope of government agencies.
Makes sense. Okay, what's next?
Then there's the America First angle. This could be about reshaping how the U.S. presents itself to the world, controlling the narrative, so to speak.
Okay, so less about promoting American values abroad and more about focusing on American interests.
Potentially, yeah. And this ties into the idea of reducing international commitments and focusing more resources on domestic issues.
I see. Okay, so we've got smaller government, America first. What else?
Now, this is where things get a bit more controversial. Some folks believe this is about targeting the supposed deep state within these agencies.
Ah, yes. The deep state, we knew that was coming.
Right. It's become a bit of a buzzword. But the idea is that there are individuals within these agencies who are working against the president's agenda.
So this executive order could be seen as a way to purge those individuals or at least to weaken their influence.
That's the theory, but we need to be cautious here. Is this deep state idea a genuine concern or a convenient bogeyman?
Right, we need to look at the evidence or lack thereof.
Exactly. We can't just accept speculation. We need to be critical thinkers and demand concrete proof.
And speaking of motives, let's not forget the good old budget hawk argument. Cutting agencies always plays well with those who want to see less government spending.
True. But the billion-dollar question is, what's the cost of these cuts? What are the potential unintended consequences, both domestically and internationally?
Exactly. That's what we're going to be unpacking in this deep dive.
Because it's not as simple as just saving money. We need to consider the broader implications, the potential ripple effects across the media landscape and beyond.
All right, so we've got the what's and the why. Now let's get into the meat of it. Let's explore the arguments both for and against shrinking these agencies and really dig into the potential consequences.
Let's do it.
All right, so let's break down these arguments for shrinking these agencies a bit further. We touched on that less government is a better idea, but how does that actually apply to USAGM specifically?
Well, one argument focuses on USAGM's organizational structure.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big operation overseeing all these different broadcasting networks, each with its own bureaucracy and budget.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot to manage.
It is, and critics argue that this leads to a lot of redundancy and a lack of clear direction. Kind of like a ship with too many captains.
So the thinking is streamline, it consolidates resources, you know, get everyone rowing in the same direction, and boom, greater efficiency.
Yeah, that's the theory. They also argue that relying more on private media companies could be more cost-effective.
Ah, okay, so the government wouldn't be directly responsible for the production, the distribution, all of that?
Right, essentially outsourcing the message,
Hmm.
which they argue would free up resources and allow the government to focus on other priorities.
Hmm. I see their point, but that raises a whole other set of questions for me. Wouldn't we be losing a degree of control over what's being broadcast?
That's the trade-off, and that's what makes this debate so tricky.
Right, because if it's all about promoting American values and interests, wouldn't we want to have a say in how that message is crafted and delivered?
Absolutely. Supporters of this approach would say that the private sector is more agile, more innovative, less bogged down by bureaucratic red tape. They argue that it's about unleashing the power of the free market to promote American values.
Okay, I'm trying to see it from their perspective, but I'm still not entirely convinced, especially when we consider the audiences that USAGM targets. We're talking about places where press freedom is limited, where governments control the narrative.
You're hitting on a really important point,
Hmm.
and it's one that critics of this executive order are very concerned about. If these private companies are operating in these environments, wouldn't they be more vulnerable to pressure, to
Mm.
censorship, even intimidation?
Exactly. And that brings us to, I think, one of the biggest risks associated with shrinking USAGM, the potential for a void in reliable information.
Mhm.
If these American-backed outlets are diminished, who fills that void?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And to really understand the stakes, we need to hear from the people who are most affected by this.
Mm,
The journalists, the citizens in these countries who rely on these outlets for news and information.
absolutely. So I'm really glad we have you here to provide that context because you've actually spoken with journalists who work in these regions, right?
I have. And their perspectives are crucial. I spoke with a journalist in Eastern Europe recently who told me point blank, Voice of America is the only reason people in my country get unbiased news.
Wow, that's powerful. And it really highlights the tangible impact that USAGM has on people's lives, especially in places where access to a free press is a luxury, not a right.
Exactly. And if those voices are silenced or even weakened, the consequences can be profound.
Right, we're not just talking about some abstract principles here. We're talking about the potential for increased disinformation propaganda, a weakening of democratic norms.
It's like creating an information black hole, where truth and facts are harder to find and manipulation becomes the norm.
That's a scary thought.
It is, and it underscores the need to really understand how information warfare is being waged in the 21st century.
So not just broadcasting propaganda on shortwave radio anywhere.
Not at all. We're talking about countries like China and Russia, who are actively using state-controlled media, social media manipulation, even cyber attacks to influence perceptions and undermine Western democracies.
So a much more sophisticated game than just trying to drown out the other side with your own message.
Exactly. It's about sowing discord, spreading misinformation, eroding trust in democratic institutions. It's a long game.
And that's why USAGM's role is so critical, right?
It is. They've developed strategies to counter these narratives, to provide accurate information, and to support independent media in these contested spaces.
So cutting back on USAGM isn't just about saving money. It's potentially giving up ground in a global information war with very real consequences.
Exactly. And it also sends a message to our allies.
Mm-hmm.
They rely on USAGM to provide an alternative to state-controlled media, to support democratic movements, to counter authoritarian propaganda.
It's like imagine you're a journalist in a country where speaking truth to power is incredibly risky, knowing that you have the backing of the U.S., that there's this organization dedicated to amplifying your voice, providing resources, even protection. That has to make a difference.
It does. I interviewed another journalist, this time in Southeast Asia, who told me, when I report on sensitive issues, I know USAGM has my back. It gives me the courage to keep going.
Wow, and that's something we often forget about in these policy debates, the human impact.
Right. These are real people, real lives.
Mm.
And the risks they face in pursuing the truth are very real.
And so to just casually dismiss those risks as collateral damage in the name of efficiency or budget cuts, that's just not acceptable.
I agree, and it brings us to a broader point. Shrinking USAGM doesn't just weaken America's voice abroad. It also has implications for domestic trust in institutions.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about it that way. How so?
Well, if the government starts dismantling agencies that have traditionally been seen as guardians of truth and objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
it can erode public faith in the government's commitment to those values.
So it's like a ripple effect. You start by cutting funding for international broadcasting, but the damage goes much deeper, potentially undermining trust in government institutions across the board.
Precisely. And in an era of increasing political polarization and distrust, this is a dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah, it's like we're saying truth doesn't matter or facts are up for grabs, and that's a very slippery slope.
It is. And it plays into the hands of those who seek to sow chaos and undermine democracy. Because if people can't agree on a shared set of facts, how can we have a functioning society?
That's a huge question. And it leads us to another critical aspect of this debate, the potential legal challenges to this executive order.
Right, because this isn't just a theoretical discussion. This order has real-world implications, and it's already facing pushback.
So let's dive into that. What are the legal arguments being raised against shrinking these agencies, especially USAGM?
One argument is that it violates the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Critics say that by attempting to control the content and funding of USAGM, the administration is infringing on freedom of the press.
Right, because the First Amendment protects freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and USAGM has traditionally operated with a degree of independence, free from political interference.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of congressional authorization. Critics argue that significant changes to agencies like USAGM require approval from Congress, not just an executive order.
So they're saying this move oversteps the president's authority.
Right, and that could lead to a major legal battle that could drag on for months or even years.
And even if the order is eventually struck down, that period of limbo could do real damage to USAGM.
Absolutely. We're talking about potential funding freezes, staff departures, difficulty in planning long-term projects. It's a recipe for disruption.
And on top of the legal challenges, we have to consider the potential shifts in the media landscape that are already underway.
Right, because this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
The media landscape is constantly evolving, and this executive order is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
So if government-funded media shrinks, who steps in to fill that void? What are the implications for the future of information?
That's the million-dollar question. And it leads us to our next segment, where we'll explore some of those potential future scenarios and what they mean for you, the listener. Because ultimately, this is about more than just policy debates and legal battles. It's about the information you consume, the choices you make, and the future of our shared reality.
All right, so we've talked about the arguments, the risks, the legal battles ahead. But what does the future hold for USAGM and for global media as a whole? I mean, what are the possible scenarios that could actually unfold from here?
Well, I think the first thing to consider is the legal battle. There's a good chance this executive order ends up in court with opponents arguing it violates the First Amendment, exceeds presidential authority, all of that.
Right, and as you said earlier, that could drag on for years, creating this huge cloud of uncertainty over USAGM's future.
Exactly. And even if the order is eventually struck down,
Yeah.
Which is certainly possible, that period of limbo could do real damage.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about funding freezes, staff departures. Imagine trying to plan long-term projects with this hanging over your head. It's a recipe for disruption.
It is, and regardless of the legal outcome, we're already seeing these ripple effects in the media landscape. This idea that if government-funded media shrinks, who rushes in to fill that void? I mean, it's naive to think that space will just remain empty.
Right. Nature abhors a vacuum or something like that. So who are the contenders? I imagine private media companies are kind of licking their chops at the prospect of expanding their global reach.
Oh, absolutely. We could see a surge in private media ventures, particularly those catering to specific audiences or ideologies. Think of it as a more fragmented, niche-driven media landscape.
Okay, so more options, more voices, but potentially more echo chambers as well, right?
That's the trade-off. It could be good for diversity, but it also raises concerns about the spread of misinformation and the potential for manipulation.
And let's not forget about the elephant in the room, foreign influence. Countries like China and Russia, they've been investing heavily in their own state-controlled media outlets. They're not just passively watching this unfold.
No, they're not. They see this as an opportunity, to expand their own propaganda networks, to push their narratives, to undermine Western influence.
And they've got the resources, the technology to do it effectively, right? I mean, we're talking about sophisticated social media campaigns, AI-generated content, even cyber attacks designed to discredit rival outlets.
Exactly, and that's what makes this so concerning. It's not just a shift in who controls the airwaves. It's a potential paradigm shift in how information is disseminated and consumed. And frankly, that's pretty unnerving.
It is. It really is. And it makes me think about our role as citizens in all of this. I mean, if the information landscape is becoming this complex, this potentially treacherous, what can we do to navigate it effectively?
That's the million-dollar question, and I think it starts with education.
Yeah.
We need to equip ourselves and future generations with the tools to be more discerning consumers of information.
So media literacy, critical thinking skills, all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
First and foremost, be skeptical. Don't take anything at face value, especially information that's shared online. Question your sources, check for biases, look for evidence-based reporting.
And be wary of anything that seems too sensational or emotionally manipulative, right? I mean, those are often red flags.
Absolutely. And it's also important to diversify your media diet. Don't just stick to the same sources or echo chambers. Seek out different perspectives, even those that challenge your own beliefs.
That's so important. It's in those uncomfortable spaces where real learning and growth can happen.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of your own voice.
Huh?
Support quality journalism, whether it's through subscriptions, donations, or simply sharing reliable information with your networks.
And hold those in power accountable. Demand transparency, challenge misinformation support organizations that are fighting for press freedom and a more informed society.
Because remember, the future of information isn't predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the conversations we have.
So stay
Di?
curious, stay engaged, and stay vigilant, right?
Absolutely well said.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive in every sense of the word. We've gone from budget cuts to information warfare, from the First Amendment to the very future of truth itself.
It's complex, it's challenging, but it's
Yeah.
also incredibly important, because ultimately the information we consume shapes the world we live in.
And on that note, we want to leave you with this thought. Don't be passive consumers of information. Be active, be critical, be part of the solution. Because the fight for truth and a more informed society starts with each of us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time.